Sound is faulty.
Sorry. Can we move on? No. I am the son of Harry. He was the son of Abi, who was the son of Harris, the son of Yitzchak, the son of Yankel, the son of Nachum, the son of Aaron, who in turn was the son of Yossel. Yossel was born around about 1700 in Varanova, near Lida, in the Grodno region of what is now Belarus. To the best of our knowledge, all 8 generations were bakers. And so you see, it's in my blood. Warszawski is a person from Warsaw, Wileński a person from Vilna. And similarly, Grodzinski means a person from Grodno. When surnames were adopted in Napoleonic times, anyone with an association with Grodno, the town or the province, might have been called Grodzinski. Indeed, when my brother Michael, a retired Israeli policeman, Googled Michael Grodzinski policeman, he found another Michael Grodzinski, also a policeman, but this one was from Canada, a Catholic, no relation. Voronova was a small village, a shtetl. Lida was the nearest large town. It was the home of another Jewish baking family, Grodz, a name that some of you may recognize, who intermarried with the Grodzinskis throughout the 19th century. More about them later. Tsar Alexander II of Russia was assassinated in St. Petersburg in 1881. And guess who was blamed? Well, you're all on mute, but I can hear you say, the Jews. The anti-Semitic rioting, pogroms to us, flowed throughout the Pale of Settlement, which led to mass emigration. Hundreds of thousands left Russia for the USA, for Palestine, and in our case, for the UK. Judith, my great-grandmother, and her husband, Harris, Aaron, came to these shores around 1888 with their children, Sarah and Abi, my grandfather. My great-grandmother Judith, born Gordy, was one of 7 siblings. Each one of them was either a baker or married to a baker. These are the 7 siblings. They all came to England, except Hirsch, the youngest, who stayed in Europe. And he was murdered by the Nazis in 1942. So you see, baking is in our blood. The refugees brought their trades with them. Great-grandmother Judith rented the bakehouse of an East London master baker, Barnett Gullivitz, which was in Bell Lane. And as he finished his night shift, she would come in to bake bilkelach, sweet knotted rolls brushed with egg and sprinkled with poppy seeds, which great-grandfather Harris sold from a basket in the nearby market. Can you see Harris in this picture? Well, if you look very carefully, you might just spot him or not. It's really a where's Wally question. Their product was good and they prospered, although evidence that I've seen seems to suggest that they were not exactly penniless immigrants. And within a few years, Harris and Judith had bought their own bakery at 31 Fieldgate Street off Commercial Road in the epicenter of the Jewish immigrant community. Judith, my great-grandmother, had a sister, Ganesha, which in English she called herself Jessie, Goyd. In another Grodzinski Goyd marriage, Jessie married Harris's nephew. Chaim Elia Grodzinski was his name. And they also came to this country to be London bakers. Chaim Elia and Ganesha established their own bakery in Bedford Street, now called Cavell Street. And it seems that Harris and Chaim Elia, pictured here, were in a joint business called H. Grodzinski and Company. We don't know whether the H was Harris or Chaim, but I don't think it really matters. Let's look at an advert which appeared in London's only weekly Hebrew language paper, Yehudi. The advert is interesting. In translation, it reads, "Warning from Harris Grodzinski, the baker who is praised and famed for his good colours and cakes that excel in their wonderful taste and are the best in the city of London, who requests from everyone who knows him to beware of those who compete with him, not with the quality of their merchandise, but they deceive the customers by minting Grodzinski's seal on their merchandise so as to attract to themselves the customers. Therefore, whoever wants to acquire for his money good bread of fine flour free from any impurities should turn to me. Also, all my acquaintances know that my baking is the ultimate of kashrut. I separate challah according to the rules, and I do not bake my bread, God forbid. My shops are open to all seekers at 20 Bedford Street and 31. Now, from this text, we learn that A, Harris is religious, he keeps Shabbos, he takes challah from his dough, and the fact that he was advertising in a Hebrew language newspaper, he was a Zionist. Furthermore, we see that it was acceptable for Jewish bakers to self-certify that they were kosher in those days. The Beth Din at that time supervised butchers and they supervised Pesach products, not much more. Let's look at the image that was in that photograph. It had been taken by the famous photographer Marx Perkoff, and it was also used on an inedible label baked into every Grodzinski loaf for over half a century, until in World War II, when a zealous officer from the Ministry of Food visited Schneider's yeshiva in Stamford Hill, he found a yeshiva bocher cutting away the label and the tiny amount of bread that was attached to it. War meant zero waste, and the official hot-footed it to Grodzinski's head office in Dunsmure Road and ordered my father to stop labelling the bread. I mentioned Bedford Street and Fieldgate Street. The two families were located there. The 1891 census shows my great-grandparents, Harris and Judith, at 31 Fieldgate Street, and Chaim Elia and Ganesha at 20 Bedford Street. However, the 1901 census, 10 years later, shows the reverse. And by 1911, the families had gone back to their original addresses. The mystery was solved At our 1988 centenary celebration, when Chaim Elia and Jesse's oldest son, Phil Hyams, then a sprightly 94-year-old, explained that his parents were better entrepreneurs than my great-grandparents, and that when Harris and Judith's business needed revitalizing, Chaim Elia stepped in. He swapped bakeries with his uncle stroke brother-in-law, Harris, and then moved back a few years later when the business was back on his feet. It's just a matter of turning left and not right as you drove to work. It involved moving your whole family and your home as well as your business. And I think that is an example of true charity. Shabbat was sacrosanct in the Grodzinski home and bakery, but British law made it almost impossible for Shabbat observant bakers to survive. It forbade all baking on Sundays and additionally did not allow shops to open after 1 p.m. on the Christian day of rest. Closing for 2 days a week would have meant financial ruin, so Jewish bakers both campaigned to change the law and they flouted it. In 1897, Harris was spotted by a spy from the London Bakers Association who was on the lookout for so-called unfair competition from the Jews. And Harris tried to persuade him not to prosecute. And as you'll see in this clipping, I don't know if it's clear enough, but I'll read it to you. He said to the spy who was going to report him to the authorities, you don't want to take me to court. Why don't you come in for a glass of schnapps instead? But to no avail. There was laughter in the court and a 10-shilling fine. That's 50 pence to you and me for each offence. The campaign to allow Sunday trading continued. And 5 years later, it reached the Lord Chief Justice, who decided that the law was the law despite any hardships. And so the campaign moved to Parliament for a new Sunday trading law. And as you see from the second newspaper clipping, which is slightly to the right, Rosie, might have to make it smaller. Oh no, it's the left, here we are. Harris was no stranger to court. He was also prosecuted for using bad eggs. We won't go into that right now, even though it's actually a cracking story. Campaigning against unfairness is also in the blood. In 2012, the budget had proposed a pasty tax, which would have added 20% to the price of anything sold hot. At that time, an extra 50 pence tax for a hot challah. My Edgeware staff and I demonstrated against this at Boris' London mayoral hustings, and I lobbied local MPs and joined thousands of bakers at a massive demo opposite Downing Street. I even got a mention here in Hansard. Back to our own history. In 1903, Harris made his first expansion, and he took over a Stoke Newington bakery, as shown in this advert in the Jewish Chronicle. We now come to a relative, Chaim Fink. Well, he wasn't a relative at the time, but he learned Gemara with Abi. Abi was my grandfather, the son of Harris. And he suggested that Abi meet his niece, a young lady from Funkstadt near Frankfurt in Germany, by the name of Bertha Yeidel. They met, they fell in love, and were married in 1908. And here is their ketubah on the right-hand side and their wedding dinner menu. Bertha and Abi set up home in Fieldgate Street. And here they are pictured outside their shop. I'd like to study this picture. Take a look at the grating to the basement. Beneath this grating was the bakehouse, typically for that time located below ground. Hot and cramped bakers would work 6 12-hour shifts a week, making massive doughs by hand, baking their bread in coal-fired ovens, which they kept going without a break. No air extraction, and their only holidays were 9 days at Pesach and other Jewish holidays. Let's look at the window. There's a notice in the window. This baker's shop, a trade union shop. And for those who couldn't read English, in Hebrew characters, it says, this baker's shop, a trade union shop. The trade unions wanted to force master bakers to employ only union labor. They did this by encouraging the public to only buy from union shops. And the semi-Yiddish English used in the poster was for the benefit of immigrants who could speak but could not yet read English. Behind Bertha in the picture is Israel Kenrick, married to Abi's sister, Sarah. So he was my great uncle by marriage. He and later his son Hilly were flour factors. They sold flour to Grodzinski until the 1970s, and his son David lives in Mill Hill. Go back to the picture again. And circled here is Russia Kayla Grodzinski, great-grandmother of Lester and Mike Abrams, if any of you know them. My father is also in the picture, but can't be seen. He was born a month or two after the photo was taken. Abi, my grandfather, was an entrepreneurial person. He was a partner in a soda water business, and in his will, we find that in 1917, he had opened another bakery at 107 Cornwall Road, Notting Hill, 9 kilometers from the East End. And here is a picture of that location, albeit not with Grodzinski in occupation. Bubba Devora Goyd. This was Judith's mother, and my wife, Rosie, thinks that she looks like a gargoyle. My father told me that every Friday morning after the bakers had finished work, she would bake her own batch of challahs, sold in the Fieldgate Street shop at a premium price. They were called Bubba Devora's challahs. She died in 1917, and for a number of years after, Bubba Devora's challahs continued to be sold at a premium until eventually it was realized that Bubba Devora was no longer making them. Abi and Bertha, my grandparents, had 4 more children after my father. They would take seaside holidays in Westcliff, and during World War I, they had a home in Letchworth away from the Zeppelins. Everything was rosy. At the end of World War I, in the autumn of 1918, I'm about to tell you that the second family tragedy struck, but I haven't told you about the first one. I'm not quite sure why I missed it. In 1904, my great-grandfather Harris died at the age of 54. He left the business in somewhat of a turmoil. Chaim Elia, his brother-in-law, stepped in and marshaled the family, all the other bakers in the family, to run the Fieldgate Street shop until Abi, my grandfather, was old enough to take over. In the autumn of 1918, the second family tragedy struck. Abi took to his bed after an evening walk on Letchworth Common with what he thought was a cold. In a few days, on a Thursday night, he succumbed to Spanish flu and became one of the 250,000 who died in this country during that pandemic. He was buried on the following Sunday on his 10th wedding anniversary. And at this point, Rosie.
Oh, that's a big, I've lost it now. He employs me to tell the soppy stuff. So he tells all the interesting stuff, and it's my job to do the emotional stuff. This is a story that's really very dear to my heart. I'm still, after more than 50 years of marriage, a newcomer to the family. And my job is to deal with all the emotional stuff. The story that I'm going to tell you now is very close to my heart, as you will understand as it unfolds. There was a family called Jacobs, who owned a Jewish delicatessen in Woolwich, southeast 18, so south of the river. Each week, a barrow boy would take a cart of Grodzinski products under the Blackwall Tunnel, under the River Thames, and out to Woolwich to supply that shop. The barrow boy wasn't just a barrow boy, he was much more than that. Don't forget there were no telephones, there was no other communication, and this was a really essential part of the networking that went on between the different parts of the community, especially from north to south of the river. One Friday in October 1918, when asked how things were doing on his side of the river, he told them, very sadly, that Mr. Grodzinski had died of the Spanish flu at the tender age of 32. He was buried on his 10th wedding anniversary, as Johnny just told you, leaving a widow and 5 children under 9. As history would have it, the Jacobs family had had a new baby that week, who had not yet had a Brit. The name of the daughter of the family and her young husband was Rosenberg. So there was a Rosenberg baby that had not yet had a Brit. The Jacobs were so saddened by the death of Avram Bezalel Grodzinski that on the following day, they named their new baby also Avraham. That baby, later known as Albert Rosenberg, was my dad. Creepy. My father was named after Johnny's grandfather before we were even thought of.
So, Bertha is a widow, 5 young children. The family advised her to sell up. No, she was a strong woman of German Jewish stock. She said that she could manage, she had to manage. She sent her 2 oldest boys to her family in Germany, where they got a good Jewish education. And Granny Bertha, with the help of a Welsh lass called Florrie Thompson, looked after her other 3 children and single-handedly ran the business for the next 12 years. Jewish master bakers were in awe of her. I found minutes of the London Jewish Master Bakers Protection Society, where a meeting was discussing prices of bread. In those days, you were allowed to do that. And I believe that it was talking about putting the prices down rather than up. The meeting decided on a certain course of action, and they voted on it. And then the minutes record one baker perking up and saying, well, Mrs. Grodzinski isn't here, and it really doesn't matter what we say. If she doesn't agree, there's no point us making any decision whatsoever. 12 strong men, employers, they were in awe of her.
My story?
Which one? You're not there yet, are we?
No?
We are indeed, I'm sorry.
My story. Okay, I've given you the tragedy and now for the romance. Bertha Grodzinski, known to all as Granny, was widowed very young with 5 small children. She was a force to reckon with. She was reputedly the only person to have the Harrods van called to the East End of London. Against all sensible advice, she insisted on taking on the business by herself. She sent her 2 older boys back to Germany to be educated and entrusted the care of the 3 remaining to a young lady called Florrie Thompson from Wales. Harry Cole, a new barrow boy for Grodzinski at the time, immediately fell in love with her. The 2 stepped out together, as they did in those days, and in the fullness of time, he got down on one knee and made his proposal, "Florrie, will you marry me?" To his utter amazement, she turned him down. When he pulled himself together, he asked her why. Her reply was simple. I need to stay with Mrs. Grodzinski until the children are grown. She needs me. And thus it was that they waited 10 years before they got married, lived happily ever after. I'd like to read you a couple of excerpts from an email that we received from Hazel Cole, their granddaughter, in 2015. Dear Jonathan, thank you very much for your lovely email. I spoke to my father the other evening and he gave me a bit more information about my grandparents and your family. After Harry and Florrie got married, they returned to Bedfordshire, where Grandad was a farmhand. Sometime in, I would imagine, 1932, the farm went bankrupt and my grandparents were faced with having to put their 2 young daughters into a workhouse and themselves into another workhouse. But somehow your family heard about this and my father was offered the job as a roundsman at 91 Dunsmure Road, and the family was able to stay together. Thank you. The family then moved to 34 Stamford Hill. Dad thinks it was because there were bigger premises, as he was born in 1934. And my mother and her family lived in the alley behind the shop, Willow Cottages. And they met and played as children and eventually married in 1957. And they were married until the death of my mother for 57 years. Thank you. The final reason our family is always grateful to your family was after the retirement of my granddad, and he was ill and the hospital and doctors in Stevenage couldn't find out what was wrong. Your family found that he was unwell and took him to see their family doctor, who discovered he had a type of cancer and ensured that he received the best treatment. And my father always says it gave him 10 more years to spend with his family. So thank you. So you can see, not only was there romance between the people who worked there, but there was a real bond between the family and their workers, as today.
I'd like to show you an extract from my father's diary in 1930. Tuesday, the 28th of January. Sender has a fight with Charlie in the bakehouse. Result, Sender has a broken jawbone. Wednesday, the 29th of January. Have Sender's round. Managed splendid. What exactly happened here? On Wednesday, the 29th of January, my father was woken up by his mother, now Granny, Bertha, and Harry, Sender's not well, you have to do his round. You have to go round all the grocery stores in the East End with our bread and deliver it. He pulled the duvet over his head, or the equivalent of the duvet, probably blankets in those days.
On the deck.
And he said, I can't do it. And she said, why not? And he said, I don't know the way. And she said, don't worry, that's no excuse. The horse knows the way. And so the bakers put the bread onto the cart. My father got up on the cart and clippity-clop, the horse trundled out of Fieldgate Street into Commercial Road, round the corner, Balance Road, and the horse stopped outside a Jewish delicatessen. My father jumps down and he said, I'm Harry Grodzinski, does Sender normally deliver to you? And they said, yes, how did you know? And he said, I didn't know, the horse knew. Sender's name was Zobin. Our rabbi in Ner Yisrael in Hendon is the great-grandson of that Sender. I asked him whether he had a picture of his great-grandfather Sender, but he couldn't find one. So second best. Look carefully in the background of this picture, which was taken a few months later, and you will see the horse. I challenge anyone listening to this talk to tell me that that wasn't Sender's horse. If we can move on. Again. We talked about Harry Cole proposing to Florrie Thompson. Harry went on to work for Grodzinski for, well into the 60s, 40 or 50 years. And even after he had left, we would meet up, families would meet up twice a year. On Boxing Day, my Uncle Ruby would go down to Stevenage with a car laden with goodies from the bakery. And on Erev Pesach, Harry would come up to London so that we could sell our chametz to him. November 1930, 12 years after my grandfather had died, my grandmother had been running the bakery and her two sons were now joining. And my father was an unmarried young man. He would go out to parties on a regular basis and he would meet people from the suburbs and would be introduced and they'd say, Grodzinski, ah, yes, we remember the name Grodzinski. You used to make very nice bread. Used to, and he would come home to his mother and he'd say, you know, Mum, we've got a brand. Well, he wouldn't say we've got a brand because that wasn't how you spoke in 1930. He'd say, you know, people still hanker after our stuff. There are suburbs out there where they are just waiting for us to open. And so in 1930, as shown again in my father's diaries, my grandmother bought an existing bakery from a Mr. Hurstley at 91 Dunsmure Road in Stamford Hill. The shop is still a Grodzinski shop to this day. And the bakery was moved from the East End, also a basement, but it was a much, much larger bakery. And that was the beginning of the expansion of Grodzinski. Pre-war, another 4 shops were added in Stamford Hill, Willesden, Hendon, and Cricklewood. Grodzinski were following their customers to the London suburbs. Additionally, they established what were called rounds. What was a round? The van driver would deliver a large quantity of bread to a garage, say in this case in Temple Fortune or in Cricklewood, and bread was sorted out there and barrow boys would come with their barrows, which they would push by hand round the local area. They delivered twice a day to households, once early in the morning with rolls for breakfast, and then later on mid-morning with bread and in order to take the next day's order. If we can move on. Here are some pictures of my father and my uncle at work, and my father enjoying an eclair, and my uncle surrounded, this is already in the 60s, by his manageresses at the wedding of one of his daughters, Monica. In 1942 came the end of self-certification for kashrut. Grodzinski took on cadastre supervision, which one way or another has lasted for 70 years. The war meant that there was no more, or that it halted expansion. There was a shortage of labor, the rounds had to be stopped, and there was also a shortage of food, which meant that there was rationing post-war. More of this later. Immediately after the war, the expansion continued. Hampstead Garden Suburb, Golders Green, Edgware in 1948, Willesden, and also a foray into Marks and Spencer's in 1947. My father managed to get allocations of very rare, very hard to get raw materials. And he went to Marks and Spencer and they started selling his bread and his fruitcake. Lasted about 6 months until in early spring of 1948, a phone call was made to Marks and Spencer to say that for a week there would be no deliveries over Pesach, of course. And the answer was, if you can't deliver for the week, forget about delivering altogether. Okay, it was good whilst it lasted. Food rationing ended in 1954. Two major changes. One, Pesach baking, which had taken place until the war broke out, restarted, and fresh cream, dairy cream, was available. A patisserie was opened in St. John's Wood, High Street, staffed by Swiss patissiers. My father, who spoke German from his education in Germany, recruited young men who wanted to learn English and would come with their skills, their baking skills, to London for a year or two. There followed 15 golden years in the late 40s and the 50s. We had 24 shops around London. 20 tons of flour were being used a week. 16 tons of Pesach cakes and biscuits were sold each year. The company had 200 employees. And in the mid-1960s, the fourth generation started to join the business. Emmanuel, my cousin, an accountant, David, who'd come from yeshiva, and in 1969, myself. A decade later, Daniel, my cousin, and Monica, a dressmaker. Profits were ploughed back into the business, and in 1969, all the small bakeries that we had established in Hendon, in Tottenham, and in Stamford Hill were amalgamated at Overbury Road into a 25,000 square foot location in South Tottenham, where 4 vans would make twice daily deliveries throughout London. This was our bag from the 1960s, showing all our branches. The 60s and 70s showed 2 innovations. The West End branches started selling filled rolls before it was fashionable. And Goode Street, Great Chichester Street, Broadwick Street, and later Leather Lane in Holborn and Bishopsgate developed a lunchtime trade feeding hungry office workers who no longer wanted to bring packed lunches from home. The other change was grocery. The spare wall opposite the traditional bakery counter cried out to be used, and just as Israeli goods were reaching UK, we started selling them. In retrospect, I don't think this was a particularly good move. We were bakers, and I don't think you can be all things to all people. We became weaker in a way and open to attack, and that attack did happen in the late 1980s. Israeli bakers came over to London, one after another. They brought something new to London's Jewish community. They baked on the premises, giving the perception of greater freshness over our factory's centrally baked bread and cake. First, it was Shalom Bakery in Ilford, then the Nissim's Sharon Bakery in Stamford Hill, then Moti Carmeli in Golders Green, and Abbey Avital in Hendon Bagel Bakery. We tried to fight back, installing hot bread shops in Golders Green and Stamford Hill, but it was too late. The Israelis had hit hard at our customer base, and because of the investment in our central bakery and the cost of potential redundancy, we had no choice but to go into receivership. My good friend and accountant at the time said, after a few years, people will forget it. Don't talk about receivership, just talk about financial rearrangement. Well, okay, whatever you want to call it. We actually did have to change. April 1991, my cousins and I bought a number of shops from the liquidator. Daniel and Monica bought 4 shops, including Golders Green and Edgware. I formed J. Grodzinski and Daughters in North London, and each company baked from their own hot bread shops. The arrangement worked well, and the business began to thrive again. In 1997, Daniel emigrated to his wife's birthplace, Toronto. He worked at various things. He said, I'm not going to go back into the bakery business, it's enough. And he phoned me one day and he said, Johnny, I want your opinion on a shop I've been to see. I said to him, Daniel, what sort of a shop is it? And there was silence at the other end for a moment, and he meekishly said, it's a bakery. So you see, he couldn't get away from it. It was in the blood. He'd emigrated. I bought edgeware from him and from Monica. And she continued for 7 years in Golders Green working on her own, at which point she sold that bakery out of the family. In 2007, I started a modernisation programme. I rebuilt and refitted Dunsmure Road, and then did the same in Clapton Common, both in Stamford Hill. And then refitted Edgware. I bought a third shop from the neighbouring Chinese takeaway, put a coffee shop in, air conditioning, automatic doors and bright lighting in all places. In Stamford Hill, in 2016, I bought the neighbouring Clapton Common shop. And for those who might have been brought up in Stamford Hill.
That's you, Marlene.
It was previously called the Stip, a gambling machine shop. We installed a massive double shop there. And as you can see from this clip in The Apprentice, will it play, Rosie? Just over a year and a half ago, I sold the 2 Stamford Hill shops and the bakery there. The buyers insisted on keeping the name Grodzinski, and thus was born our new brand, Grodz. We announced earlier this year that Grodz of Edgware had bought the old Grodzinski Golders Green premises, and following extensive rebuilding and refitting, it should open sometime this summer. Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of our story for the moment, and I am proud to be carrying on from generations of Grodzinskis, from Yossel in the 1700s, from his son Aaron, from his son Nachum, from his son Yankov, from his son Yitzchak, and from his son Aaron Harris, whose son Abi was the father of my father, Harry, and my uncle Ruby. My ancestors knew nothing about websites, about electronic data capturing, about HACCPs, nor even of air conditioning. They hadn't even heard of sushi or falafel, but they did excel at attention to customer needs and at making a high quality product. They were charitable, and they always tried to be appreciative of their staff. And in all those ways, we try to emulate them. Thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them.
That was absolutely fascinating, Jonathan. Thank you so much. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions coming up now. Maybe I'll just open up with one, 2 actually. I want to ask you if you've used the same recipe for your different breads over the years. That's one question. And the other one was, I wondered in the war years with rationing, how did you cope with all of that?
I'll take the second question. I'll take the second question first. You had to be practical. So we've still got recipes from the war years. Mince pies, instead of being sweetened with sugar, were sweetened with carrots. There was all sorts of labour-saving ways of making things. I think platting might have gone out for quite a while and round colours predominated. Scones, I'm told, were just cut out on a cutter without being rounded. All sorts of labour-saving measures. And do we still use the same recipes? Well, that would be nice to say yes, but I think anybody who just, other than perhaps whiskey producers, if you have to recognise that tastes actually change as the generations move on. People don't necessarily want the same product or the same taste. I've seen it. We used to sell 50% of our bread that we sold was rye bread. It's declining. In Stamford Hill, almost non-existent. In Edgware, it's still there, but certainly not 50%. So you have to move with the times. And if that means if people say to you, I'd like things less sweet, or I'd like whatever it is, and if you hear enough of a trend of people wanting things in a certain way, then it makes a good idea to use your ears and to listen to them and to follow.
For example, we now do a gluten-free range, we do a sugar-free range, and you'd have to listen to what the people are looking for in this day and age.
However, our golden cookies are still the same recipe that Granny gave us, and our fruit biscuits hark back to at least the wartime, if not earlier. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I still like rye bread. Yeah. Okay. Lots of hands are up. Clemmy, do you want to start?
Yeah, it's actually not a question, it's just a statement. First of all, I hope Aviva is well. She was my beautiful daughter, my future daughter.
She is well.
What I want to say, when I took my grandchildren to the museum in London, are you aware there's a tiny little exhibition of Grodzinski? Are you aware of that?
We're talking about the Museum of London?
Yes.
It's a forgery.
It's a forgery? What do you mean it's a forgery?
Okay.
Well, it's not
there is a baker's tray, a wooden baker's tray in the Museum of London, which has got Grodzinski on the outside. It's part of an exhibit saying it's a Victorian street scene. It has a reference number 8/62 on the side of it. That was my father's reference for August 1962. So why they thought it was Victorian, I really don't know.
But it's still nice to have your family name in the Museum of London.
Absolutely, absolutely. All publicity is good publicity.
Well, my grandchildren were very excited to see it.
Thank you.
Okay, Eva, do you want to ask your question? Unmute yourself.
Hello, Rosie and John. I just wondered whether any of your daughters eventually stayed in baking. I know one or two helped out at some stage, but any of them stayed with baking?
When we named our business, they were still teenagers, and I thought, give them a reason. Call it J. Grodzinski and Daughters Limited, and maybe, just maybe, they will join. Teacher, social worker, psychotherapist, mum looking after,
head teacher,
but not one of them is a baker. They've helped in the business tremendously here and there, but no. So your next question is, what happens in the next generation?
We'll have to see.
I think the same thing is going to happen in London and in Toronto, that Grodzinski will continue as a name, but it won't be owned by the family.
Well, it's a pity, but time goes on.
Okay, David, would you like to answer your question? You're mute, David Harris.
Yeah, Jonathan, I don't know how good your memory is.
We were in Machaneh together in 1964.
Exactly my point. Now, my standing
and the Rosh Machaneh
was that I was visiting in the 1960s in the Peak District. And I recall from time to time during the course of the 2 weeks, cakes arrive. from, I don't know, some mysterious baker. I wouldn't know who it would be, but I remember that as a very interesting part of the holiday. So the cakes would come addressed to you. Whether you ever got a piece of the cakes, I have no idea, but I think lots of other people did. But I'm pleased to know that it's not just my memory. This did really happen.
Dave, it certainly did, and it was fruitcake generally, and we actually do make that recipe to this very day.
Okay.
On holiday with our friends, we take it with.
Nice to see you.
Are you there, Jonathan?
I'm here.
As I didn't hear anything.
You want me to repeat that?
Yeah.
The question was, David asked whether he remembered being on holiday in Bnei Akiva camp in the 1960s, and he asked me whether my memory was still good, and I said it was in 1964. He said it was in Peace District. I told him it was in Edale, and he remembered cake being sent by post by my father, which I distributed around the Machaneh.
Okay.
We
Thank
still
you.
make
Just
that
the
very
last
cake
bit
to
was
this.
frozen. Yeah. There's a question in the chat. What is the difference between light and dark rye? Is it just the colour?
I don't quite know how to answer that. Rye bread used to be called brown bread, brown bright. It used to be much darker than it is nowadays. It's one of those things that customers prefer, a lighter bread. You could get a very dark rye flour, which the brown rye was produced. We don't make it anymore. We've gradually changed to a whiter variety.
Thank you. Okay, Roy, you've got a question.
Jonathan, you've got a delightful story. It's fantastic to hear from you. One could be tempted to ask what went wrong with your daughter's education. But
Could the person who's hosting this meeting, could they block Roy?
What I want to ask you, do the recipes vary from branch to branch?
Yeah, absolutely. So much so that well, we now, for the moment, we only have one branch. But when we had Stamford Hill and Edgware, if we brought a baker from one to the other, we would have to tell them that Stamford Hill customers like them well baked, and that Edgware prefer them lighter baked in general. In Stamford Hill, you can't sell much fruit cake. They want chocolate, and vice versa. So you use your ears and you follow what your customers want, and you adapt in each place, and that's one of the benefits of having a local bakery.
Thank you.
Oh, is it me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Talking about brown bread, I remember I was very fond of brown bread when I grew up in Manchester, and it's true, like you say, you can't find it anymore now in the Jewish shops. I have to go to the Polish shops to get that, and it's made from sourdough, I believe. And I don't think any of the Jewish shops seem to use sourdough. Is it a skill that's passed us by amongst the Jewish bakers?
Sourdough or artisan bread is something that we're going back to nowadays, but it is there's a small demand. It's not a question of the skill being lost. As I said earlier, it's a question of following what the customers want. You personally may hark back to a particular type of bread, but if your customers don't want it, there's no point flogging a dead horse.
But there is a wonderful range of artisan bread in the Edgware shop.
But,
Yeah.
Olive bread.
wherever you go, sorry, but it's talking about sourdough bread, wherever you go, or it's everywhere, in all these trendy outlets, it's everywhere. And so and especially in America. And I'm surprised you say there's no demand for it.
Sorry, maybe I've been misunderstood. I thought you were talking about sour rye bread. We do make a range of sourdough breads, olive bread, wheat bread, walnut and raisin bread.
Okay.
And different flatbreads with onions and all kinds of all lovely.
Okay.
They're separate. They're on a table in the shop. Go have a look.
Yes,
Okay. Thank you.
It's not having a branch in Wembley, in Kenton, which is what we're missing most.
We had one in Wembley for a number of years, but apart from Sunday, it was not I'm not in a stage of life to be opening new branches. Although my wife has insisted that I do some last venture in Golders Green.
Are there any more questions?
Yeah, I would like to make a comment. We're going there. You mentioned earlier that the adverts was in the only Jewish paper around. I believe that was the Yiddish Voice, printed in New Road, around the corner from Filgate Street, which existed for a very, very long time. And the other thing is that my mother used to tell me when she was a kid, she would take the Shabbos meal down to the bakers to put in the oven overnight so they could have a hot meal on Saturday. Just the only two comments. There.
Yes, if I can pick up on the second. Bakers, whether they were Jewish bakers or they were non-Jewish bakers, and the only difference was on which day of the week this would happen, had ovens which people didn't necessarily have in their home. Therefore, the Shabbos cholents, or in the case of the non-Jewish, the Sunday roast, would be taken to the bakers, in our case, on a Friday afternoon. And for the princely sum of threepence, you could put your cholent in the oven, which still hot and retained its heat for a long time. And you marked it in some way so that you got your own cholent back. And on Shabbos morning, Rosie's mother remembered being sent before she was bat mitzvah so she could carry the cholent home. And that is how you got a hot meal. Before there were ovens, people had ovens at home.
Yeah.
In the non-Jewish world, the Sunday roast would be taken, and depending on how long the vicar's sermon was for, you either got an overdone or a well done or not done Sunday roast. But yes, absolutely. And in every community around the world, there's evidence of this.
Yeah.
Can I just ask a further question?
Yeah, David.
That extract from the newspaper that was in Hebrew. Sorry, am I okay? Yeah.
Yes.
That extract from the newspaper that you said was in Hebrew, from my untrained eye, it does seem as though it was Hebrew and not Yiddish. And can you confirm that it wasn't Yiddish, and why wasn't it Yiddish? I would have thought it would have been Yiddish in those days.
Okay, so there was a guy by the name of Sawalski, an ardent Zionist. You can Google him, and he spent his fortune, but I don't know whether he had a fortune, on producing a Hebrew language newspaper in England. It wasn't Yiddish, it was in New Road. And this newspaper existed, I think, 10 to 15 years at the end of the 1890s through to 1985, certainly. And if you want to actually see it, go to the Jews College Library, sorry, the London School of Jewish Studies Library. They have copies of it, and you'll see that advert in there. I believe that my family were very Zionist from the fact that they actually put their advert there and nowhere else, not in the Yiddish papers, not in the Jewish Chronicle, but particularly there. And there's a whole story in the newspaper itself, which somebody else will have to tell the story.
Okay.
There's a lovely message in the chat from a lady called Yvonne Cheney in Southern California. She says, thank you so much for this wonderful talk about your family, and I'm sure it's making everyone hungry. Shalom is what she said.
It's very nice.
Jonathan, I'd like to thank you so much on behalf of us all. It was a wonderful talk, fascinating. We all
was our
enjoyed
pleasure.
it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was our pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was
All the best.
Lovely.
We enjoyed it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thanks. Thank you, Maurice.